I'm just going to rotate these. And try and get them into a position where they're just pinging around to the bottom. So on the left side, that also reaches and we kind of hit like a midpoint in the lighting. You can see as I rotate that light, it's just subtle changes like this that are the difference between it wrapping around and simply fading off down the bottom here. And I can make the light fairly thin, yet the material on the left in V-Ray is blurring it and giving us some more depth and shape. So for now, because it's quite difficult to get the light happening down the bottom here, I'm just going to leave this set up on the front and I'm going to duplicate the light, which you can do in a couple of ways. I can either right click the light in the light list menu, or I can go up to the top here and click the two square boxes. And I'm just going to start trying to get the light on the left matching correctly as well. Now, because of the angle of the suit, it's much easier to get this light appearing kind of correctly up and around the reactor itself. Now I'm going to leave the light and I'll just go into the render settings and up the diffuse here. I'm going to leave the light on the lower side of the suit because as I go up higher, you'll see it starts to create a bit of a wobble in the surface. To keep things as thin as possible, if I just go under that little bit, it's still wrapping around, but it's keeping things more simple on the suit itself. We're getting nice highlights up on and around the neck, but also you can see now on the head, because we're trying to get things matching symmetrically here, everything goes out of whack. So you should pretty soon be able to understand why I do things this way. Now another thing to look out for early on here is how bright the gradient background you've got enabled is. So at this point, I might even be able to turn it off, and now I can get a quicker preview of kind of what the reference material looks like. Yet there's enough light now where I know where everything else is in the scene. So if I go back into Photoshop and just drag our reference in, you can see now I'm getting things matched a little bit closer. I'm just kind of wriggling around things here so you've got a clear understanding of how I'm matching things. Now, of course, usually I'd have all this reference up on their own individual screens. So now I'm going to duplicate this light once more, and now I'm going to try and get the lighting happening on the back of the shoulder pads. Now you can see I've got two choices here. I can either get the silhouette on the whole back working, or I can go a little bit further up on the shoulder pad and try and get the reflections wrapping around the side. So for this, I might actually need two separate lights. So I'm going to create one light for the side here for the shoulder pads. Now what's going to start to happen is that on the side of the Iron Man's head, things are going to start to be overlit. So I need to start trying to factor in if I'm going to be rendering out two separate passes for Milton to work with, because what he can do is hand paint in the pass that's catching light on the right shoulder pad and paint it away from the area like the head. So it's always good to kind of keep that stuff in mind. So I'm going to rename this light. I'm going to call it shoulder light. And I'm going to go capital solo. And if I call it solo, it means I know there's a possibility that I need to render this light with only that light enabled. So what I'll do is I'll turn everything off and just give Milton a render pass like this, that he can blend in over the top of the other layers. So I'm going to duplicate that light again. And I'm going to start playing with putting it at the back of the mesh now. Now also, because I don't want to distract myself with the other lights I've enabled, this is where a photographer might go in. If they're hand placing the light at the back, they'll get the kind of assistance to turn off the two front lights so they can focus purely on the silhouette of the object itself. So I'm going to play now with potentially changing the height of the light and the width and also the brightness, because as the light goes further behind the material, obviously things become more reflective and the overall brightness increases. So I need to be careful with that, and I'm just going to adjust things so I still can see some of the gradation in the light itself. As you can see here, I've kept the rotation the same, so next I'm going to just start playing with that to see if I can get things looking a little bit nicer. And remember, I do want that light to be affecting the left side of the shoulder pad. But I'm not sure, because I've turned the front light off, if the green light I'd set up at the start was kind of affecting that area. So I'm going to quickly turn that on. And you can see we're left with an area here on the left side which doesn't really catch light from anything in our scene at the moment. So this is where I might kind of bring the light over a bit more to the other side and just start playing with the length and height of the light. And because of just the overall shape, it's looking like I'll need to create that with two separate lights. So I'm going to go back on the width of the light to make it a bit smaller and just localize the highlights to the left side of our render. So you can see I'm just constantly making little tweaks here because of the fact that I am working in real time. It's so easy to, find that perfect spot. So don't just kind of flop it into an area and say that's good enough. You'll see that I really try and focus on getting things lined up perfectly. Now, if things aren't easy to spot because of the zoom level, and now remember also I'm used to working in HDR Light Studio full screen while V-Ray's off on the other screen, what you can do is if you've only got one screen, I can just zoom in with the zoom tool and then quickly pan to the left. I don't need to see anything but this back area. And I'm just turning the gradient light back on so I can see where this light is kind of reflecting a little bit more clearly. Now it's also important to realize sometimes you'll kind of move a light into a position that's catching a nice highlight, but that you didn't really expect would happen. In that situation, what I'll do is I'll rename the light to what it should be. I'm just going to call this shoulder pack. And sorry, my finger's broken, so I'm kind of just typing with my 2 index fingers. And I'm just going to duplicate this light again and go back to trying to position it behind the shoulder itself. You can see what's happening here is it's creating some nice highlights up on the inside of the shoulder and around the metallic part. But it's also not really looking great on this right hand side, and this is where I might need to paint away from that and let Milton deal with the 2 different lights blending together. But sometimes having a separate light visible in the scene, which does bring out that detail, can help you the type of light you want to use on the silhouette of the object. So you can see now, because I've added that front one in, things are starting to look a little bit better. One of the issues I've got though is that on this left hand side, the silhouette light is a little bit too thick, and on the right hand side it's a bit too thin. So I've got a couple of choices here. I can either try and do it with 2 lights or 1 light and rotate things. So if I turn off this light, you'll notice the silhouette's gone on the right hand side. So I'm going to just do some final tweaks to this light, and I think what's going to be best is to add another light to catch the back edge here. Now you'll also notice if I zoom in here, you can see what's happening is the light gets a little bit more thick around this edge. So one of the things I'll take note of at this point is to let Milton know that he might need to go in and paint that out. So as a retoucher, he's got the ability to go in, select a kind of red light, or use even parts of a different part of the render to blend in and make sure that that silhouette is perfectly even the whole way around the edge. And it's those subtle details that really bring out the professionalism in a portrait job like this. So I'm going to duplicate that light now and start trying to get it to work on the back side. Now you can see the light's kind of catching, and we've got a very similar width on the silhouette of the object itself. Inside of HDR Light Studio, and if I just pan and zoom out once again here, so we've got things back into the full view. You can right click on a light inside of the viewport and it will select the closest light you've got. So you can see now this light selected, but if I go in and right select over the opposite side, and sometimes it can be a little bit tricky. So there, I've just right clicked on this light, it's gone and selected that. So it's a quick way of selecting the lights in the scene. But it's not really playing ball once again because I'm recording the lesson. So now if I turn this light off, you can see that the effect that's happening on the left here is really good, but on the right side shoulder it's not. So you'll notice what I'm going to have to do is turn this light off, duplicate it, and get it looking nice on the right hand side, and then I'll render off the shoulder in 2 separate passes so that I can get the left shoulder looking nice and this right shoulder. So now I'm going to zoom in and start working on this light. So one of the limitations at the moment with V-Ray RT is that I can't go in and assign one V-Ray light to affect something in the scene and not the other. So basically the exclude and include aren't working. So what happens is what I've got the capability of doing in the production render is, and I've done this on some car jobs, is I'll turn this V-Ray light on, save this out as an HDR, and then I'll go into 3ds Max, and let me just close this down. You can see I've had to kind of minimize the 3ds Max window. So I'll go in, create 2 separate HDR lights, and in the exclude and include, I'll exclude the right-hand shoulder from being affected by that light. Then I'll go back into HDR Light Studio, and let me just realign all this stuff here. Then I'll render off an HDR for the right-hand side, create a separate light in V-Ray, and then set that to exclude the left-hand shoulder. And the end result is we've got 2 separate HDRs lighting the same scene, but with complete control. So rather than getting Milton to blend the two in post, I've rendered it all during the same time, and we don't lose on that rendering time. So that's something I'm going to look out for and take a note of. So this is where I might go in and just create a text document that I've got here, and I'll just make some quick notes of that while I'm working. So I'm going to write in the text document here, render left and right shoulder separately. And then I can get back to working on things. So you can see I'm just experimenting with some different light shapes and sizes, and I'll also go in and maybe try and adjust for some specific lights the fall off of the light curve. Because now we're dealing with lights that are on a bit more of an angle, and I can bring out some different effects. And V-Ray RT is just quickly going out of sync here. Sometimes you've just got to leave it for a little bit and let it kind of update. And you can see now it's gone back to working again. So I'm going to keep working back on this shoulder light now. And because of the way the left shoulder looks, you want to try and keep things at least fairly consistent. So if I turn this light off and turn the other shoulder light back on, you can see the shoulder itself isn't overly lit. I've got the front end of it being lit up and the back end being lit up. But overall in the middle, it kind of just fades between the two. So now I can't really go in and create the side light and make the shoulder entirely lit up. So what I'm going to try and do is bring the light a little bit more towards the front. And maybe start having a play with creating an effect more like this, where it's just kind of fading off between the two. And I let the shape of the object and the way the light fades off determine the way the object looks. Also take in mind that your geometry is not always going to be perfect. So I could technically go in and alter this so that the smoothing, and let me just bring up 3ds Max here. I'll just pause that. What I mean by this is I could go in and adjust the geometry so that it rounds off a little bit better. But unless you're prepared to go in and do that for every piece, eventually you're going to try and have to settle for ways to make the geometry, make the lighting work with the geometry you've got. And if I'm creating a highlight that incorrectly bounces off these 3 panels, it's probably not best to leave it, because at a high res, you're going to see the fact that the geometry is not perfect. Whereas if I move the highlight just a little bit over to the left, you can see I'm hiding that error in the geometry a bit better. But of course the lighting still doesn't look perfect there, so I'm just going to have to keep playing. Now, if I've got a highlight that I want to kind of spread a little bit more throughout the center, I can adjust the bulb width. So I'm not increasing the width of the light, I'm just increasing the width of the hotspot at the center of the light. So I want to increase the intensity of the light until the center is roughly matching the brightness we've got on the back. And I'm still not really happy with how this is looking, but if you ever hit a dead end and you don't know how to get past it, my advice is to move on to the next light, take note of the things you're not happy with, and potentially once you add in some other lights into the scene, you'll be able to go back and more accurately fix that up, as opposed to just working with this on an empty kind of canvas. So one thing I'm doing here now is I've turned on the other shoulder light, and just as a very quick preview, rather than doing anything in Photoshop, I'm just using my finger over the monitor to block out this area here on the mesh, and all I'm trying to do is compare the left shoulder pack to the right shoulder pack. So like I said, with my finger covering that area, I can kind of determine that the front right edge here is just a bit too bright. So I'm going to go back and go into the left shoulder, and I'm going to brighten that HDR up a bit. Okay, now is a good time to go back to the start, and I'm going to turn on all the lights, and we can kind of see where we're at. Now, compared to the reference image I've got on the bottom left here that I've drawn my own hand-placed lights over, there's still a couple of areas that aren't catching highlights that I kind of wanted to. Now that's this blue light here. So now I'm going to go in and make another light and get it to try and catch the top of the arc reactor. So I can just go in, duplicate one of these base lights, and start placing that. But because it's near the center of the surface, I'm going to need to make sure that that light's got the same width as it does have height. And I'm actually inside of HDR Light Studio. You've got the option to move the lights in the stack. So I'm just going to move this light towards the top. And you can see HDR Light Studio is closed, so I've just got to restart that. If you ever hit an issue like that, you can go back into 3ds Max. All you've got to do is close down the connection, start it up again. It'll load HDR Light Studio, and because you were saving to a temp file, you won't actually lose any of your work. But you will need to export the scene again. So make sure you're from your camera view, export that out, and you should be good. Alright, I've got the brown light at the top now, and I'm just trying to position this back in where I want it to go. What you can see happening here is on the left, if I just zoom in down towards this arc reactor area, is when I'm putting the light directly on the center and we're getting these two highlights banding off, it's overlighting this area. Now this front panel has too much going on and the underneath side has nothing going on. So unless you're prepared to like light underneath here, and I'll just quickly show you what I mean by that, I can duplicate this light, unless you're prepared to get every edge catching, which makes your life a lot more difficult because the more lights you add, the harder it is to get those working harmoniously together. It's too much at this point I'm seeing up here. So maybe just for this inside piece, I can do a render layer just to catch that. But for now, let me delete this light I've created down the bottom. What I'll do is I'll stretch the light to be a bit wider than I wanted it to. And I'm just trying to get it to rotate until it hits that highlight. And now maybe I can do a render just to blend it in on the front here. But I definitely don't like how all these highlights are catching. So I'll hide that light, and I'm just going to rename this, and I'm going to call it Reactor Light. And then just put a maybe next to it because I'm not sure if I want to use it. But I do still need to catch the left side on the silhouette over here on the shoulder pack. So So I'm going to duplicate another light I've got in the scene. It's quite a tricky area to light because there's so much going on here and there's so many different angles that the suit's bouncing off at that it's hard to just get it to go right on the edge and pick up highlights from both areas. You can see as I go towards the edge down the bottom, up the top on the shoulder kind of doesn't work out as much. So I'm going to disable the lights happening elsewhere in the scene, and it's just going to let me focus purely on that one light and what it's doing. Alright, now I can go in, see how this is looking. I'm just going to start to one by one enable the lights. So I'm fairly happy with that. The only thing I want to fix up is this light that we've left over on the shoulder area. So I'm going to turn off the bulb width that we set up earlier. I'm going to zoom back in on this area, and this time I'm going to disable all the other lights while working on this one and try and get this locked off, because at this point I can start to do my first render inside of V-Ray at high res to kind of see how things are looking. And for now, like I said earlier, I was going to render the two HDRs separately. I'm just going to leave this in because I just want to make sure that the lighting I'm putting in at the moment is making the shaders react in the correct way. So back inside of V-Ray, I'm just going to render this at 1920 wide. And see how it looks with all the bump mapping and small details like the V-Ray dirt affecting the scene. At this point, there's a couple of things I'm happy with, and there's a couple of other things I want to change. So what I'll usually do at this point is kind of step back from the screen. What I mean literally is take a few steps back and kind of stare at the image from afar, trying to figure out what I'm liking and what I'm disliking. One of the problems you'll encounter working as a CG artist is when you're constantly staring at an image, you kind of lose focus of the bigger picture. There's times where I'm focusing on just one area of the mesh and I don't realize that everything else is lit, nowhere to that standard. So I'll try and take a step back, give myself a few minutes to, process everything, and then come back with a new plan on what I want to do to fix those problems. So after taking a look at this image, I think I've gone just a little bit too bright on the left-hand side here. So I'm going to do my best to fix this. Another issue I've got is that I'm lighting underneath the shoulder pad here. So I'd probably request Milton to fix that. Even though it's something that might not be physically correct, it's just little details that kind of detract from making this shoulder appear like it's clipping over the top of this other piece. Like you can see here where the shadow is consistent. I'm happy with the shaders, but if I go back into Photoshop and compare the two, the reds in this render are a lot more saturated. So I'm going to go back into V-Ray now, and this is where I'd adjust the hue and saturation and just have a play with trying to get those matching. Now it's very, very kind of touchy, so I'm just going to go to 0.06, and you can see that just gives a little bit more of a solid red color throughout the suit material itself. Now I'm going to go back into HDR Light Studio and just play with those settings. But before I do that, I've got to load up V-Ray RT again. So I'm just going to duplicate this to the max frame buffer so I've got it kind of sitting around and I can compare this for later on. And I'm going to make a couple of those small changes, and then we're going to get on to lighting the helmet. You can see by shortening this light, I've effectively stopped the spread reaching that area of the shoulder now. Because if I go longer, it kind of doubles up and we get that kind of ugly highlight pinging off. Now it's got a nice easy transition. Now, one other thing I wasn't really happy with is even though the front highlights on the arc reactors look cool in that they're pinging off, it detracts a little bit from the realism. So I'm going to remove these two lights just from the front and see what happens when I add a more realistic circular light into the mix. And I'm just going to play with potentially, just for showing you guys, using some of the presets that come with HDR Light Studio. So any one of these I can just simply drag in. And you can see the texture from the light also is affecting the actual reflections. So I'm not really happy with that, so I can just right click it and delete it. I'm going to try and play with something that may be a little bit more consistent. So you can also change the color of lights even though they're loaded from a texture. So I'm just playing with a blue light here. Now, I'm not exactly saying this is going to work, it's just that I'm willing to test it out to see if this is something that's going to be better than utilizing the two stripes on the surface. So what I am noticing is these are giving a nice effect on the gold side of things. So even though the chest area I'm not really happy with, when it comes to lighting the helmet, I think I'm going to stick to using these picture lights just because of the extra detail that they give off inside of the reflections. So I'm going to hide that for now. I'm going to go back to using the two lights that I had. Just because I don't think the way this suit is designed, it's very easy from this angle to get a more aesthetic look than this. So I'm going to delete that reactor light. I don't think I need it. And also what I'm going to do is near the end of this lesson is show you all the render passes required that I'd hand off to Milton on a job like this, so if he does want to add highlights to edges, he's got all the options there for him in post. So I'm happy with where things are at. I'm going to give one more try on this shoulder piece. So I'm just going to zoom in on the shoulder area. So to get this looking a bit nicer, and it's such a specific light, I'm going to close the V-Ray frame buffer, reinitialize it at a higher resolution, and then show you just a region of what that looks like. So I'm going to double the size. Actually, I'll just go up to what I was rendering earlier. And just let that load up. And now I've got a much better idea of how this area is looking on the mesh. So I've turned off the other side of the shoulder just to see this area without the distraction. Sometimes you run across areas like this that are just quite stubborn, and you've really just got to play with kind of every combination available. So I know it might seem a bit boring, but this is the type of stuff that I run into while lighting, that I've got to, you've just got to spend the time to solve it. So finally now I've hit an area where I'm getting a nice kind of sheeny gloss coming off, but I'm just going to drop that down All I'm trying to do is create some highlights over the shoulder area itself. And you can see, because there's a slight issue with the alignment of these two panels, that it's making my life more difficult. But I'm going to leave that for now, because that's also something, if you're short of time, you could ask a retoucher just to touch up for you. They'll just paint in the highlight on that one area. Now I don't know if I want a highlight running down here. So let me just duplicate this light. And you can see I've just kind of helped bring out this shape without affecting any of this stuff down here. So I'm going to disable the region render and just let V-Ray RT start rendering the whole thing. And now I can go in and add back the lights. So rather than wasting any time, what I do now is I'm just going to put, for the sake of organization, I just add in a gradient light down the left here, and I just call this chest below. And what I mean by that is everything below this is designed for rendering the chest. So now I can just move this light above, the halogen light above, and turn off all these lights and go back to a starting point. And now anything above this gradient light I know is designed purely for lighting the helmet. And now I'm just going to play with the colors, because the stronger I go on the orange, the more gold the material looks. I'm going to all the way down to the bottom, and I'm going to turn back on the gradient light so I can see where things are on the mesh. And if you want to reset your camera view, hit the camera button here and just go back. It'll just reset that for you. So I'm going to disable the base now and go purely working on the halogen. Now this time, because the gold's a lot more important, I'm actually looking at the V-Ray RT window here while working.